Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Clarice Rosa Sharif, and I'm the Chief Program Officer of Literary Programs at PEN America. And our mission is, at PEN America, is to unite writers and their allies, I think you, to defend the freedom to write and celebrate literature and the power of storytelling. And so this is our 18th PEN World Voices Festival. I got distracted because I saw somebody that I recognized. Andrew, thank you so much. It's so great. Actually, in the audience today, I have so many of my colleagues from PEN America who work so hard on our advocacy, and it's great to welcome them to this event and to have them enjoy what we do so well once a year at least, celebrate writers that we love, writers that we read, but also writers who are champion of the freedom to write. So sorry for being distracted, but I was like, I love this room. And after I'm done with talking, I will join you and sit down and enjoy the event myself. So this is the 18th year of the PEN World Voices Festival, and since 2005, the festival has stayed true to its original mission, to celebrate the power of storytelling and literature in translation, and to convene global voices across borders, language, and culture, and to really tackle the most pressing issues and urgent matters that we witness and that we know are going on in the world and also in our society. And I'll just mention the amazing work that PEN America is doing around book banning. If you are not following what's going on, please do go to pen.org, look at our advocacy page on this issue, and get people involved. It's frightening, and we want people to take it as seriously as they should. So this year we are proud to present 40 events featuring more than 100 writers over 4 days of celebration, dialogue, and cultural exchange. Today is day 4. It's sad, but we had a good run. So if you didn't have enough, look at your program. There are a few more events until we close tonight, so I hope to see you there. I want to thank our bookstore partner, the Strand Bookstore. They have been a wonderful host and partner all along. And I'll just point out that the books are available for after the event. They are signed, pre-signed, and the way I always suggest people can support their writers and literature in general is to buy books. So buy books for you, buy books for your friends, and just share the bounty. Today's event is titled Intelligence and Artifice, How Will AI Change Literature? And our speakers, Harry Kanzuru, Andrew Morantz, and Megan O'Giblin, join us for a conversation on whether the creativity of artificial intelligence systems like ChatGPT and others will compete with the human imagination, what these models mean for the future of copyright and the future of the publishing industry. Harry Kanzuru is the author of 6 novels, including Gods Without Men, White Tears, and Red Pill. Megan O'Giblin is the author of the books God, Human, Animal, Machine, and Interstates. And Andrew Morantz is a staff writer at The New Yorker. He's the author of Antisocial, Online Extremist, Techno-Utopians, and the Hijacking of the American Conversation. And today, Andrew is our moderator. I hope you enjoy the event. Thank you for coming today.
Hi guys, is this thing on? Hello, hello, hello. Hi. You know who everyone is now? The intro took care of that? Okay. So I am going to not start this in the most cliche possible way, but in like the 3rd or 4th most cliche possible. The most cliche possible way to start one of these is to say, welcome, I'm so glad to have this amazing conversation with these esteemed writers, and then finish the paragraph and then say, you wouldn't believe it, but I didn't write that paragraph. A chatbot wrote that paragraph. That would be the most. I'm not going to do that. But because I think we're enough months into this thing now that we've all seen those things before, but I'm going to do a slightly different one. I was playing around this morning, and I did some auto completions, and we're going to get into what these things are that we're talking about in a little bit of a, explanatory way, but I figured it would be useful to just put some text on the table, as it were. And if this gets dreadfully boring, I can stop. But I basically took a couple of sentences and went to a couple of these chatbots and said, I'm going to start off with a sentence. Can you keep writing in that style? And we're just going to see, because we're going to be getting into whether and how this thing can write, what came out. So the first one I did, there's a fantastic E.M. Forster story called The Machine Stops, which is still sort of classic of the genre. And when I put the first sentence into ChatGPT, it kept going. This is not you won't be able to tell which one is the bot. You'll be able to tell, but I'm just going to read what it spit out. So the first sentence is, imagine if you can a small room, hexagonal in shape, like the cell of a bee. It is lighted by neither window nor by lamp, yet it is filled with a soft radiance. That's the actual. And then the way it completed it was, the space brims with an ethereal glow, casting delicate hues upon the walls as if the very essence of illumination emanates from the room itself, illuminating the contours with a serene and enchanting radiance. So kind of like overwritten, kind of repetitive in weird ways, but not incompetent. Then this is what Bing did, which is the same underlying technology, but tuned differently. Imagine, if you can, a small room, hexagonal in shape like the cell of a bee. It is lighted neither by window nor by lamp, yet it is filled with a soft radiance. There are no apertures for ventilation, yet the air is fresh. There are no musical instruments, yet the room is filled with a faint melody. There are no books, yet the walls are lined with shelves full of knowledge. This is the room of the master, emoji of a wizard. And what's really weird about that is that I had the same reaction. I sort of laughed at how absurd it was, and then I looked back and saw that some of that was actually plagiarized from the original text, and some was just totally hallucinated out of thin air. I'm just going to do a couple more of these, and then we're just going to start the actual discussion. I did one of yours. Do you want me to do one of yours?
Sure.
Okay. Tired and preoccupied, I arrived in Berlin the next day to begin a three-month residency at the Deuter Center, out in the far western suburb of Wannsee. Wannsee? In this state of weariness and preoccupation, I embarked upon my journey to Berlin, brimming with anticipation for the creative sojourn that awaited me. The next day unfolded like a delicate tapestry as I stepped foot in the vibrant city, ready to immerse myself in the nurturing embrace of the Deuter Center. Right, so this is ChatGPT again. It has this weird habit of taking any affect and just making it this weird kind of corporate positive affect. So it starts with a very clear tonal signal, and it just inverts it because it's like doesn't believe that negative affects exist. Here's the Bing version. Tired and preoccupied, I arrived in Berlin the next day to begin a 3-month residency at the Deuter Center out in the far western suburb of Wannsee. I had been invited to work on a project about the history of German literature, but I felt like an outsider in this city that had seen so much turmoil and change. The Deuter Center was a modern building surrounded by a lush park, but it felt cold and impersonal to me. I missed the warmth and vibrancy of my home in Barcelona. That was Bing. I'm just going to do one more of these, and then we're going to actually get to it. This is from Megan now. This is Megan describing ChatGPT, and then ChatGPT is going to complete it. The model exists in an ether of pure signifiers, unhampered by the logical inhibitions that lead to so much deadweight prose. In the dream world of its imagination, fires explode underwater, aspens turn silver, and moths are flame-colored. Now here's ChatGPT. In the boundless realm of its linguistic domain, the model transcends the constraints of conventional logic, allowing ideas to intertwine in exquisite complexity. In this ethereal landscape, the boundaries between reality and imagination blur, giving rise to surreal visions where underwater fires dance with enchanting brilliance, right? This kind of like 7th grader with a thesaurus kind of thing. And then this is the Bing version. In the dream world of its imagination, fires explode underwater, aspens turn silver, and moths are flame-colored. The model creates its own reality where anything is possible and nothing is forbidden. It does not care about the rules of grammar or logic, only the beauty and power of expression, emoji of a paint palette. So I put all that on the table just to say, I'm going to ask both of you to explain what's going on here for people who are totally lost. What are these chatbots? What are they doing on some basic technical level? And what can we make of the weirdness of all this?
You want me to start? Okay. All right. So
Thanks, everyone, for coming today. Yeah, so large language models are basically, it's a type of technology that uses a neural network, which is a technology that's loosely based on how the human brain works in theory. And what they've done is basically fed a ton of data, a very large corpus of writing into these models. So a large portion of the internet, digitized print sources. And the model basically starts to learn patterns of sort of statistical regularities in the way in which language functions and creates a wholly original, usually most of the time original output based on what it's learned from what text it's consumed. So, you know, you often hear people say that it's a very fancy version of autocomplete. Which is true to some extent, right? The model is, in some sense, sort of just predicting the next logical word in the sequence based on what it's read. But it's also, there's, you know, a lot of sort of higher level concepts that these models pick up and learn about, you know, context, certain, you know, stylistic conventions, literary tropes that it learns just from sort of, you know, consuming this large amount of text. So it's doing... You know, I think that to say it's just a fancy version of autocomplete is a little bit misleading. It has sort of a larger understanding of concepts and context. But on a very basic level, it's a machine that is creating language based on its knowledge of syntax. It doesn't understand sort of the real world reference that it's talking about when it produces this text. So
I suppose one thing I should add is that we should talk about reinforcement learning, human feedback, and that these things aren't totally automated. That the consumer products that we're interacting with have also been trained by people responding, saying this is correct, this is inappropriate, this is a good response, this is a bad response, and so the notion that this is a totally disembodied kind of mathematically based thing would be incorrect. I mean, the training runs that these models have been on have involved a large amount of human labor.
Yeah.
It's largely also been outsourced to the global south, and that's its own sort of ethical issue, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, and we should talk about the labor aspects of this, both abroad and here. Just to get a couple of more questions in this vein, I think one question that we have to get to eventually, which we might as well just start with, is essentially like, how worried should we be? How scared should we be? We're on a literature, panel, so we can talk about that specifically. But I think in order to get to that, I wonder if, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong about this, but I've noticed what seems to me to be a kind of conflation between two kinds of skepticism or worry about this stuff. One that's in the vein of, we keep allowing these tech entrepreneur guys, mostly guys, to impress us with their purported brilliance and, that this idea that they're just going to be the drivers of human history and they're going to lead us into the future and we don't really have much agency in the matter, and we should be skeptical of the fact that they are capable of that or good at that or know what they're doing on any kind of historical level. And then there's another related skepticism, which is because they're maybe hyping things up, they have their own self-interest, they're robber barons, they then, the thing that they are selling is therefore not powerful or not capable of enacting real change in the world. And so I wonder if we can try to tease those apart and see. It seems to me that one can be quite skeptical of the motives of these companies and the way their labor practices work and the way that they do or don't have an inclusive vision of the future, without necessarily saying it's all smoke and mirrors and none of this is really going to be powerful or have an impact on our lives. Does that distinction make sense to you?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I think there are two sort of broad categories of risk that we're thinking about, and they're quite ideologically loaded as well. I mean, the one that turns up from the top is usually AGI, artificial general intelligence, the idea that these models are some sort of stepping stone towards machines that will in some way supplant us or might have purposes of their own that are orthogonal to ours. And it's very interesting to see how many leaders in the field are hyping this at the moment. I mean, it's too much of a deviation from our topic, I think, to go into that too much. But I think we should be quite skeptical of the idea that the LLMs in themselves are a stepping stone to AGI, and we should ask the question, like, why. There is an element of I alone understand this, I alone can fix it. That if our feelings about these, what we're supposed to do policy-wise about these models are orientated around this notion of existential risk, then a great deal of power is handed to the experts in the field and the people who are running the companies. Now, the second kind of category of risk, I think, is more immediate, and is it's basically a kind of enclosure. I mean, the illustrators are seeing this immediately. The Midjourney and other visual models are being trained on a large corpus of work that has been scraped from the internet without attribution and without payment, and is now being used to supplant their labor and to replace them. Likewise, in writing-based jobs, I think anybody who works in a kind of writing where you are flowing information through a well-understood format is at risk right now. I mean, you think of things like paralegals and so on, where you're kind of the contract doesn't change, the information you're putting into the contract changes. So there's an immediate issue about labor and about the kind of the change in the labor market, and you can see the dollar signs glinting in various people's eyes as they realize the wage savings they feel they could make once they have their own model to do the work for them. So those are two kinds of risk that we could talk about.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I mean, I think I've been a little bit skeptical of the just how quickly, in the months since like ChatGPT was released, the conversation has gone directly to AGI, and this idea of we're going to have super intelligence and relies that whole discourse to me. I mean, I'm thinking even of like the open letter calling for a moratorium on AI research. Which,
oddly signed by a lot of people doing AI
yeah,
research
right.
who want to make it feel even more dramatic.
Right, and it's like, yeah, well, what is exactly what is sort of the underlying motives of this? I think there's a way in which that conversation serves as a distraction, from the very real harms that the tools are causing already, and the ways in which they're disrupting our information ecosystem and the publishing industry in like more concrete ways. We already have seen sort of what's happening to digital media right now. There's been newsrooms that are closing. BuzzFeed is replaced, is already using AI to generate a lot of content. And I guess what I've heard a lot is that there's this narrative that people who are, AI is going to come for the low-hanging fruit, right? It's going to come for, these content mills, or it's going to come for very formulaic writing. And people who are doing really high quality, literary stuff are going to be safe. And for me, I don't think that that's really a clear distinction. I think, we all are sort of in this economy together. I write for these news magazines that are now going to be, disrupted by this technology. And, I've done copywriting and ghostwriting in the past. These are, sort of the first aspects of writing that are being transformed, I think, and are going to change quite a bit due to language models. Yeah.
Well, and you also wrote in one of your essays at one point, when people say these bots can never reach the transcendent heights that literary writing is able to achieve, I always want to ask them, what literature are you reading?
Yeah.
So I mean, there is, I see your point that these lines are not as firm as we'd like them to be. I mean, I guess there's two ways I want to go with that. One, I just think we should talk about this in the immediate context of the WGA strike, and what it means that has become kind of the big, it seems, sticking point in that negotiation. And then more broadly, I want to get back to this question of, whose literary voice is so irreplaceable that it's safe from this. But yeah, I mean, accepted, present company accepted.
Wish.
But it did not nail your voice. But let's start with the WGA thing, and why does this feel like an important moment? with the AI negotiation
Well,
specifically?
it's the rights that the producers are trying to reserve for themselves. I mean, there's this clause that is the sticking point where they say they essentially want the right to be able to take any work that you do and then use that to train models. I mean, and clearly what is going to happen is that any holder of a large amount of IP, Disney or whoever it would be, has a data set there that is potentially useful to train people on. I mean, I've always kind of slightly hated those sort of screenwriting gurus who kind of break everything down into a formula, the 3-act structure and so on. But it's very interesting that for years producers have themselves gone to those courses and have used those kind of formulae to judge screenplays to see whether they are correct or not. And so there has been an element by which there's been a sort of feedback element by which screenwriting, I'm thinking particular feature film screenwriting, has become highly codified. You know where certain sort of beats are supposed to be. You know where certain sorts of reversals are supposed to be in a plot. And that has prepared the ground for a potential massive enclosure and a kind of automation. So I think the writers are very correct to be worried. I mean, if you want to buy something from me to train your model, that's a different set of rights to buying a half an hour worth of an episode of television. So I think at the very least there needs to be an understanding that these are different rights, that you're selling something different if it's going to be used to train a model, and then in the future that model will be used to output, to give you that Barton Fink feeling. And so I think we should all be supporting that strike, because I think a lot of the what comes out of this negotiation will form precedent for other people in other creative fields.
Yeah. It's a lot of interesting stuff going on right now with copyright and there's a lot of mixed messages about whether you're allowed to even opt out of these models as a writer or an artist. All of the major language models and the ones that are producing images and film and everything are trained on the work of writers and artists. We weren't asked if they could use our work for the training set. We're not given attribution for it. We're not given compensation for it. And the Authors Guild is doing some interesting work right now where they've been meeting with Congress and trying to figure out a way, if there's a way to work on some sort of collective licensing agreements, where something similar to like what's happened with music streaming, where you sort of bring all the stakeholders to the table and figure out if there's a way for authors to get compensated if they are included in this training set, or just opt out. Some people would prefer to opt out, if you don't agree with how the technology is being used, or if you want to make sure that your work is not included in a training set that's going to be used to replace you at some point. And the tricky thing with a lot of like OpenAI won't release what's in they haven't said what's in their training data, so you can't tell if you're in there or not. Some other of the visual models like Stable Diffusion have said that you can opt out, but then when people actually do try to opt out or say that they don't want their work used, they're sued for it. And so there's a lot of stuff that's still being worked out with the legalities of it, but I think there's, one thing that the Authors Guild has suggested is like putting a line in your contract for writers, saying like, I don't want, my work to be used for training purposes, or looking for language in contracts that say, that your work is going to be used for research purposes or data mining or internal purposes.
It's a question of how you'd even audit that. I mean, that's the issue though, isn't it? How would you, if they breach that, how would you tell?
Well, yeah, and there's no accountability right now,
And the amount of stuff that's already been sucked into these models that, there may have been no way to find out whether the machine stops was in the training model except by querying it and seeing. And even now, because of the lack of transparency with how these things work and the lack of legibility to even the people who code them sometimes, I don't know that anyone knows, why did it plagiarize the next two sentences in the text and then start hallucinating after that? There may be no one on earth who can answer that question. So what's already been sucked into the model and how it's using those models are illegible potentially to everyone. So I guess one question then is, you, Megan, in your book, you write about patternism as a kind of counterintuitively, we think that the fact that we can't step into the same river twice makes things more impermanent, but there's a sort of counterintuitive way of thinking of it that makes it more permanent. That it seems, I don't want to, badly paraphrase your observation, but that there's a way in which the fact that our cells are always being replaced, the impermanence of the world actually in a sense makes us more permanent because it answers the question, what makes us a consistent self over time in a way that doesn't depend on the permanence of every cell. And I guess there's a question about patternism with regard to the writer's voice also, that the fact that we have these machines that are sort of clunkily, weirdly pastiching different people's voices, and they're better at some and worse at others, and if you tell it to write early Bob Dylan song about there's a hurricane coming, it can do that kind of passably well, and it won't be Bob Dylan, but it'll be close enough. I guess the question is, other than do we feel vaguely creeped out and uncanny about all of it, is there a sense in which if you opt out, if you sort of take the Bartleby approach and say, keep me out of the data set, are you opting out of the only kind of impermanence that will be available to the writer's voice in some potential future?
In the sense that you're not going to your voice is not going to make it into this model that's going to be producing all of human literature in the future.
I guess the vision is like, we actually, extinguish ourselves as humans, but the model is, spitting out friendly witticisms about subways that no longer exist for eternity.
Right.
That's the super cartoonish version. But in the version where we can't stop the runaway train and these things are somehow dominant in our economy, do you then have a binary choice between opting in and opting out, in the sense that you would if you were to say, have no trace of your writing beyond the internet now?
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I don't know if you'll be able to opt out in that sense. It's clearly been trained on my work, because I've played around with ChatGPT, and it can write, if I say write an essay about technology in the style of Megan O'Giblin, it will do something that is clear that it's read my work, but it just feels like this sort of cheap, this sort of not even a parody of my work. It's like, it's interesting you brought up that idea of voice and pattern, because I think about that a lot as what is that sort of, we tend to think of somebody's voice as irreducible. Style, what does that consist of? If it's not just the words, and if this thing is just producing words, what is there? But yeah, I don't know. I had, when I was in graduate school, I was in a fiction workshop, and I remember my professor said, you shouldn't worry about trying to imitate other authors. A lot of times writers are told, don't try to imitate authors that you admire. You should try to find your own voice and your own distinctive style. And he said, go ahead, imitate as much as you want, because you're never going to be able to do it perfectly. You're always going to be doing it in a way that's distinct, and something in you is going to sort of transcend that and shine through, no matter how hard you're trying to be somebody else. And that's a mysterious quality about voice. I don't know what that is, but I was thinking the other day when I was just playing around with these AI models, there's something irreducible about the ChatGPT voice too, where even if it's doing me, if it's doing Joan Didion, if it's doing David Foster Wallace, it all just sounds like this sort of like a cooking blog or something. It has this very sort of self-helpy, very you always feel very safe. You never think it's going to say something surprising or unexpected. It's just very smooth. And so I would hate that my voice, that's the version of my voice, the sort of GPT Megan that makes it into eternity
Megan
or whatever.
At the HR onboarding meeting or whatever.
Yeah.
I suppose it's probabilistic, and it takes the center road through any kind of semantic field, and that's that faint air of cheese that hangs around all the text that it generates is clearly to do with that. But it was familiar when you read out the text at the beginning, or the kind of enchanting,
Yeah.
the kind of
Illuminated.
like the slightly sort of late romantic
Yeah.
vocabulary that it had. It's characteristic of the output because it likes to be upbeat. I mean, GPT-3, when I was trying to get GPT-3 to tell stories, and especially stories with conflict and violence in them, and obviously because of guardrails and so on, it's very suspicious of you when you sort of say there's a dude with a knife at the end of the dark alley. And that iteration, it was almost incapable of sustaining any kind of conflict. It would be, and it all worked. It turned out it was his brother, and everyone went home happy. Nothing to see here, and it got very nervous immediately, and then closed down the narrative. And four is much more willing to kind of, seems to understand, especially if you frame it as this is a piece of fiction and I need you to describe a murder. It will up to a point go and do that. But I mean, it gets this old sort of T.S. Eliot thing about the tradition and the individual talent, that in some way we are channeling the resources of prior generations and the tradition, the literary tradition, as it comes up through us. And I suppose if you kind of squint slightly, you could see that the corpus that these models have been trained on stands in for tradition in that sense. But there's something about the averageness of it that because I started off, I thought a few months ago, I thought I'll try and write something with this, and I hated it so much. Every time I'd sit down to do it, I was like, I don't like this. I'm not enjoying it. Yeah. There's badness here, and it is to do with that flattening out and so on. I mean, it's not to say I can see ways forward, especially with things like chance process. There's a venerable tradition of literary writers using aleatory processes of one sort or another to generate text, and you can see that using a language model could be a way to do a sort of Oulipian kind of thing or something like that. And I'm sure that's an interesting direction for some people to go in. But I'm also concerned about what happens if this is the matrix inside which all our thinking and our imagining is going to happen in the future, and these grooves have been pre-dug in some way. Then certain things become unthinkable, certain things become unimaginable that are at the moment imaginable, and so my instinct is to find ways to break it and to try and kind of work out how to not have that happen. But it's very early on with this, so I'm not sure how that happens.
Yeah, I mean, there may just be at a really basic level all the sort of cheesiness of it, and the feeling that it always has an HR person looking over its shoulder. It may just come down to the Ted Chiang view is that when we worry about AI, we're worried about capitalism. We're worried about what capitalism will do to us through the channel of what will AI do to us, when in fact AI is made by people who are seeking profits. And it seems that the reason it makes bad art is because the immediate commercial incentive is always on some level going to make bad art, right? I mean, it seems like it may be no more complex than that. I mean, I guess then I wonder, so Megan, your book is metaphors in the subtitle. A lot of it is about how metaphors kind of backfill our thinking on these things, which is itself a metaphor. I've found since reading that this whole influence, and even if you're imitating something, you still come through, and all these things. I've found my own thinking on that has been now conditioned by the AI training metaphor in ways that it was not infected by that 6 months ago. And so I wonder, I used to sort of amorphously think, oh, if I read too much of this thing, then I'll sound too much like that. Now I just think I'm corrupting my training corpus. And that's very, I can't think of it any other way. And so I wonder if has your metaphorical internal vocabulary on this been changing even since you published the book, because these things are changing so quickly?
Yeah. Well, the joke now is that whenever somebody's going on for too long, you just say, stop generating.
Stop generating,
now,
right.
Yeah. This vocabulary is kind of just like
too many
seeping into,
tokens.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of my book was about, how we these metaphors that we create between our minds and technologies, which we've been doing forever. The mind is like a computer, it's like a telephone system, it's like a chariot. This goes back very far. And yeah, it seems like the dominant metaphor with LLMs is now the stochastic parrots, right? That this was a term that was initially used in a paper that was very critical of LLMs by some Google engineers. That these models are just stochastic parrots. They're using statistics to sort of just mindlessly regurgitate things that they've read in the past. They're not actually thinking. They're not actually being creative, right? Which is an important point to make. But this is totally ricocheted back onto humans now, where, I think it was like 3 days after ChatGPT was released, Sam Altman tweeted, "I'm a stochastic parrot and so are you." So this idea that we're just doing this as well, and like this is not a new idea, it's like this is like a basic tenet of like post-structuralism, like that we're just sort of, or even like Russian formalism, these sort of academic disciplines that revealed that a lot of, if you break down like any story, you can find sort of the building blocks of narrative are all sort of there. There's sort of a formula, even in very sort of high-level literary stuff. And I've encountered a lot of writers, who are writing about LLMs, talking about how, yeah, sure, I'm just also, just sort of remixing and reconfiguring everything that I've read, and I can spot in my writing, like, where, I've sort of got a certain sentiment or like what writer that I love that I picked that up from. And that's true, undoubtedly, but I think that also, when a human is doing that, like, I don't know, the thing that makes writing, to me, interesting, writing by humans, is that, there's some sort of, what is it that drew that writer to those influences in the first place? And that's different with every person, right? A human has a point of view. They're not just hitting, trying to hit some sort of statistical average. They're, bringing their embodied experience to it, which is part of that story of like what led them to be a writer, what led them to those influences. And that, I realize it's like, I don't want to start speaking in vague sort of metaphysical terms about like the human spirit, but that there is something there that's not in the models, right?
I don't think we need Geist in order to kind of defend the territory of the human against the LLMs. It's something more to do with reciprocity, which I think was what you were getting at in the, I mean, there are many ways of generating a statistically unlikely text or a kind of surprising string of thoughts or ideas, but there is something about there's a profound sort of connection with a writer when that either there is a point of view, there is somebody out in the world who is struggling with these thoughts and who is transmitting them to you through the medium of a literary work. So that interactivity, that reciprocity is surely something about there's some of the value that we find in art is that connection. I mean, and I think you can use language models in incredibly productive ways to generate thoughts, to kind of bounce, but it's a much more solipsistic thing. You're not talking to anyone. You're using a tool in order maybe to expand your range of thought for a minute. I mean, so, I think we will find very, very useful ways to use, positive ways to use large language models, all the kind of economics and labor stuff aside, but that basic reciprocity is always going to be absent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and just to hover on that, I wonder if there is, let's say that one day we have a profound experience of resonance or reciprocity with a piece of work, let's say a piece of music, just to take it out of the sphere a little bit, and then it's revealed that was, generated by an algorithm or something. I use music because that's already happened to me with music. It hasn't happened to me with language yet. But I don't know that in principle I could articulate a reason that it couldn't. And I guess I wonder if that were to happen to me, if I were to go home and read a piece of writing that moved me and that I felt some kinship with the person who wrote it and then found out that a person hadn't written it, would I then is there any way for me to set it up so that I don't then feel horrified and ashamed? Are we setting up a God of the Gaps thing where we're defining consciousness in a way that we'll later regret?
Yeah, you see, I mean, you get into all this deep territory about computational theory of mind, and I suspect that a lot of the sort of Sam Altman kind of people do think that the brain is essentially a sort of Bayesian machine, and that there's no need for anything kind of more complex and kind of understanding what that is. I mean, I'm guessing the piece of music wasn't a song; it was an instrumental piece of music. So there's an element of abstraction in that. I mean, in the way that a lot of people have been very charmed by the Africana doll generative art at MoMA as well, and yeah, I'm thinking on the fly here, so there's a sort of placeholder that I think there might be something different about the experience of certain sorts of art like that is different from, I don't know, your Bob Dylan song or some other kind of thing where that reciprocity with a human voice or a human experience might be more central to the kind of art.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer to. I mean, I've been asked that question a few times, and I don't know if I've come up with a satisfying answer. But yeah, that if you found out after the fact, that's what's interesting, right? Yeah. And maybe that reciprocity or that sense that you are communicating with another mind, like maybe that is just purely an illusion, and that's something that can be synthetically generated. But I think it's telling that like if you found out that you had been tricked, it would probably change how you viewed the work. I think for me it would. I don't know if that'll always be the case, but there's something in which, that maybe consciousness or that sense of meaning is in the eye of a beholder. That's part of how we, constitute meaning is through that interchange, and that I don't know. To me, it's telling that if you found out afterwards it wasn't human, that would change it, because I think it would. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, I guess part of what I would want us to avoid is this thing that we seem to do a lot, which is, well, sure, computers can do a lot, but they can't play chess. That's a creative act, and then they do that, and then we say, well, but surely they can't do this, right? There has to be some backstop other than the thing they've already achieved. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we're gonna start taking questions soon. I just want to tie this up just by kind of thinking about if there is a way that writing can move forward that isn't. So since we're on music, different musicians and different visual artists have taken different approaches to this already, right? So you have, for every, Drake who doesn't want the AI to be plagiarizing a Drake song, you have Grimes who says, bring it on, the more AI Grimes is the better, and just give me a cut of the revenue. And with writers, I think there are going to be a lot more Drakes than Grimeses, if I had to guess. But so I guess then the question, both descriptively and prescriptively, is there any way that we can see forward to not... I guess the question is, the art versus commerce thing is not going to change, but is there any creative way to make this stuff, to make our peace with this stuff, other than, like, can you imagine the Grimesiest version that a writer could do, or does that just seem off the table?
No, I think there are plenty of ways forward. Yeah. I mean, again, leaving aside the how on earth do you make a living side of it, and the fact that you're downstream of a model owned by Sam Altman. I can imagine you could train yourself some interlocutors, you could train yourself characters, you could train yourself models with particular registers. You could be essentially in a much more of a kind of conductor and orchestra kind of role with regard to sort of text generating modules, and that's certainly a way I would be interested in exploring. I absolutely don't think we're in a kind of break the machines kind of situation. I mean, it is going to be very challenging for certain sorts of, let's say, big R romantic notions of subjectivity, and especially of kind of sort of creativity as an emanation of a spirit. But I mean, as we get more comfortable with ourselves as sort of being embedded in the world, and that the human in that kind of sense gets slightly displaced, which is kind of a good and useful thing in many other areas of life, thinking about our relationship with the environment, for example, I think we will get more comfortable about having particular R models. We'll have things on our desktop that will do certain things for us, and I think that will be empowering and positive and lead to kind of good things. But I mean, there is just this elephant in the room about ownership and enclosure and profit.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Grimes model and whether that could apply to writers. Where her approach is just basically, yeah, take my voice, do whatever you want with it, and that she's going to split the royalties with anybody who uses it, right? I mean, the writerly voice, like the voice in prose, to me is not as distinct as as one person's voice. Like you recognize Grimes's voice whenever you hear it, right? It can, and I guess with writers, even writers that I can think of that have a very distinctive style, I don't always recognize them on the page, or it's not always easy to say like that's theirs. And style is also something that's not really. It's not covered by copyright, it's like, it's a little bit different, I think, for writers. And I guess, yeah, too, the idea of like that possibility for writers. I mean, like, how much longer is it till they don't need us in the loop anymore? When the models have been trained on enough content, like, why do you need human writers to keep producing things to train these and to make them better? So I guess that's my fear about it. In terms of like using the models in a few ways, or like in creative ways, or how I might. I've tried. I've had different models up on my desktop for many months, and I've played with GPT especially for a couple of years, and I just haven't found anything yet that it's been able to do better than I could do I think there's a way in which I'm interested in people who generate stuff and then write over it, which I think, or sort of do something really interesting with the text that's generated, right? Almost like found poetry. So I've done this where I'll have it like, produce a bunch of Simone Weil or something and then sort of write over it. But it's like, why couldn't I have just done that with, the actual text? I don't know why I would need GPT to do that. But yeah, I think the thing I come back to too is like, the promise of these tools is that it's going to make writing easier and faster. And to me, I've never found the difficulty. I find writing very difficult. It's the most difficult thing I do. It's the thing that that requires the most focus and the full breadth of my attention. And I don't find that unpleasant. That's, the challenges of it. What makes it difficult for me is why I'm drawn to it. And so the idea that these tools could somehow make the process easier or faster is not appealing. I think most people who write, they're not in it for the output. They're in it for the process, and part of that is the difficulty and the challenges of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it may be that the only way out of the whole ownership work, how to make a living question is, in fact, to shack up with Elon Musk. So maybe Grimes has it all figured out in more ways than one.
She's way ahead of the game.
So, yeah, we're going to take a few questions from the audience.
I'm thinking about a way that art history is sometimes told, and wondering if you see a parallel, which is that when artists were essentially painting lush reproductions of someone's image and were able to be supported in that way, that was one way of making art. Once photographs came to be, they became facsimiles, and art had to develop a completely different way of approaching it. Do you see that potential here, and what way do you think writing would change as a result?
I mean, various people have already published sort of AI fiction of one kind or another, and again, I've come to it with a very sort of open and positive spirit, and have ended up like kind of drifting away very quickly. I mean, what I said earlier, I think this idea of orchestrating a kind of group of modules or tones, you could kind of maybe. I mean, I had a good go at trying to get myself a sort of Chat GPT Blake going, for example, and it was not bad in certain ways. It was very sketchy and lied to me a lot about things that it was or was not taking from William Blake. But I could imagine you could have certain sorts of tones that you could use to generate on your desktop, and then harvest from those and make work like that. That seems to me a possibility. I mean, for me, I probably won't be the person to take that on, because I just like sitting in my room writing my stuff. Thanks, but you know, that's I'm located in time and space. I have a particular set of feelings about this, and other people will come along who feel differently. You know, art will change, absolutely.
Yeah, I've thought about photography before as a precedent, and this idea that, yeah, you know, once you had something that could do, you know, representational images, then we have impressionism, minimalism, cubism, like all of, you know, art really exploded after that and got really weird. And I would love to see something like that happen with writing also. There's another model too where the writing kind of gets sucked into the machine. Like I'm thinking of like Nietzsche using the I think he was the first philosopher to use the typewriter, and how his, you know, his prose, which was very fluid and sort of extended, got very aphoristic and short, and also like really interesting, but it got sort of interesting not working against the machine, but sort of being dragged into the logic of the machine. So I think it could go either way. Yeah.
I thought you were going to say typing just inherently makes you a nihilist, but yeah, I wondered about photography too, because, you know, both you have this idea that the facsimile exists and now we can move on, but yet you also still have photography museums and photography exhibits, and obviously it changes, but I do think on some fundamental level, I'm sort of just thinking this as we're talking, the having some clear idea of what the distinction is between art and commerce is kind of what matters, whether you're using photography to show you what the hamburger looks like before you buy it, or whether you're using photography to, in some sense, be an art form, is really the question, and it's not answered by the actual technological medium, it's answered by the way people use it.
Yeah, I just want your opinion about if you feel that we are a little bit like Luddites of this time, criticizing a machine that we don't know exactly what's the utility. Because at the end of the day, what's the function that it's going to accomplish for us? And if we are hypercritical with just a tool. And the other thing is that you were talking about the way that we teach this to say, this is good, this is bad, this is a bad answer. He's not a little bit more an editor than a programmer?
I mean, we're in an odd moment with these things, because obviously they're rushing to commercialize them, and the immediate uses are going to be things like customer support and generating various kinds of, like I said, like legal documents or whatever. And those kinds of uses of language demand a particular sort of regularity and a particular kind of predictability and so on. And those are slightly orthogonal to literary uses of language. So, but I am interested in what happens when we say that's don't do that, that's bad. Yeah, we like that. There's a sort of reinforcing. I mean, it'll find an attractor. It will find a place, and then if you want to get off that, how easy will it be to kind of to move away from these sort of statistically derived channels? You know, I mean, these grooves that are being cut by these particular uses. But I mean, I suspect that we'll have kind of much more personalized models that are optimized for different kinds of things within a year. I mean, we're months into this explosion of sort of public conversation about this. But yeah, those are some thoughts.
Yeah. It's a treacherous time to be writing and thinking about this so early, you know, or there's sort of this ongoing joke on the internet where, like, be careful what you're saying about AI critically, because the AI overlords are gonna, there's gonna be a judgment day at some point. But I feel like that with the future.
Basilisk.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. But with just thinking about the future generally, and I mean, we're all just speculating a lot here, and I think I have felt generally in a lot of the tech criticism about AI has been very hesitant to have a sort of ludical stance, or being too skeptical too early. And there's a lot that's unknown. But I also think, I'm old enough now that I remember, the promises of these sort of utopian promises of the internet. This is going to democratize the world.
Do you remember the metaverse?
Yeah, the metaverse. Yeah, I mean, how many things?
That was last year. Yeah.
Social media was going to topple, autocracies, and it doesn't. It seems like the same thing sort of happens in each of those cases, which is, power gets consolidated into the hands of a few powerful companies, and sort of the same outcomes tend to happen, which are generally haven't been that great in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And I would, to that point, I would sort of, I was mentioning before the kind of, I worry about the conflation of different kinds of skepticism, the kind of Luddite skepticism that says, smash it, throw it in the river, and the more informed skepticism. But I do, taking social media and the metaverse and all these things as a metaphor, an instructive analogy, I think there's a kind of skepticism of social media that says, let's be aware that for every Arab Spring there might be a backlash, for every, so many, parameters on which to be skeptical, that does not then necessarily imply the corollary, and also this thing is not going to change the world in major ways, right? Change the world is, in fact, it's like the slogan of Silicon Valley, but it's not a positive thing necessarily, it just is a fact. And so I do worry a bit about getting so interested in saying, let's not buy the hype, this is smoke and mirrors, that we also then say, this won't change the world, because then we won't be prepared for the ways in which it might. And to the point about editing, I think we should also be clear that a lot of the labor that's happening in Kenya for less than $2 a day is more like editing than coding, but it is also, it's giving feedback to a system that it's possible that no one, including the people who coded it, really fully understands. And so a lot of what I think the kind of proposed regulation, if we ever get any, is sort of looking to do is to impose legibility requirements, not even transparency requirements, because you could be transparent about all the code, but it could still be a bit of a black box even to the people who coded it. So that does feel new to me. In the social media realm, we know, okay, we're boosting this, we're de-amplifying this. In this realm, we've just stacked a bunch of layers of computing power onto a thing, and suddenly it has these weird, creepy, quasi-sentient effects that even the people making them don't understand. So that does feel new and worth worrying about to me.
Hi, yeah. So you guys were mentioning that some people are calling for a moratorium on this, and kind of also talking somewhat separately, but I think they're sort of connected, about how there's an inherent market failure here. And the way I'm thinking about this is, well, isn't that the job of the government to step in where there's a market failure? And kind of what we're talking about here with writers going to Congress and asking for kind of inserts into clauses, is that maybe far too small of a government intervention? Should we maybe be thinking a lot more broadly about, instead of maybe a moratorium on this, what if the government is the one developing the AIs and we completely remove the profit incentive? Do you think there's any utility in setting up some sort of maybe public agency or a distinct bureaucracy for this?
I mean, I can see a role for government in deciding to protect certain values or I don't know, aspects that. But I mean, have you seen who's in government? I mean, the kind of I mean, it's like kind of, does it connect to the internet? I'm concerned that you see it in hearing after hearing. The tech guys turn up to the hearing. They run rings around very poorly informed legislators who seem completely incapable of even understanding the domain that they're expected to legislate on. And so, I mean, the idea of handing some sort of absolute power over to those people seems like inherently bad. But I'm very far from being a kind of Silicon Valley libertarian. I think there is a role for government in shaping our collective life. I wish we had that there was just better informed people in those positions of power, because those hearings tend to be just painful to watch.
We could skip a few steps and just give it directly to Raytheon, and then we would have that. I similarly am not...
Smart bomb.
Yeah. Government, I do think, has a role to play, and I don't think, the regulatory stuff is many steps away from being solved by anyone, but I do think that one way that I've heard it framed nicely by Emily Bender, who is on that sort of stochastic parrot train, is to say, you often hear from the tech people, oh, this is moving so fast, regulation can't keep up, and for good reason, that there are people in government who don't understand the thing. How can we let them regulate it? And her point, and the point I've heard made elsewhere, is our rights as citizens don't change because technology is moving quickly. So if you have a right to be protected from certain kinds of monopoly power, if you have a right to be, truth in advertising, all these, we don't have much of a regulatory state left, but we have some things.
I mean, I think antitrust has a role to play here, and a kind of revival of that tradition of breaking the monopolies of the railway barons would be quite a good thing for American politics to rediscover at this point.
And it is also possible, just in principle, to say to these 4 or 5 companies, you have to be able to explain to us what these things are doing, and if you can't, then you don't get to make them anymore. And the response would be, well, then we're going to slow down, and then China. And I think response from the American government at that point could be tough luck. This is the requirement. This is all hypothetical, but.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, the Chinese government response to AI development. I mean, they're very, very happy to regulate their tech sector, and they have put some brakes on their AI people that seemed like it would be very hard for them to get to the point that that OpenAI have got to under the sort of strictures in terms of discovery and auditability and outputs of various kinds that the Chinese government wants. Sorry, I cut you off.
I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, there's the government incompetence. There's also these tech companies have a revolving door with Washington. They've spent $70 million on lobbying this year, which is more than oil and gas has, and that's just what they have to report. That's not the stuff that's going through nonprofits and dark money and all of that. So there's a lot of lip service to we want regulation. We're putting these tools out here so that people we can start a conversation about it, and we want the governments to have a role. But I think at the end of the day, if you follow the money, that's not really the case. So yeah, I don't know. That's all I have.
Hi. I've been thinking long and hard since this WGA strike started about what the future of writing looks like. And you're talking about a world in which AI can't have that writer's voice, right? But can you even imagine a world where, let's say the WGA, hopefully it doesn't happen, but let's say they lose on this point, right? And so that they're allowed to feed every screenplay in, and they're allowed to do this, right? But what if that creates a division between the studio system and an independent system? And what if the same thing happens in publishing, where actual authors and actual writers are creating content in an entirely new commercial system that is separate from the cheap AI reads or the cheap AI screenplays? Is that something that you think could happen?
And can we also, I don't know if we said what the sort of terms of the negotiation are in what is the WGA negotiating over with AI?
Oh, did you want to just clarify?
As we frame what might happen, just so everybody's on board with, when we talk about feeding writing into different models, what are we talking about?
You probably know more about
well,
the WGA.
I mean, my understanding is that the writer's position at the moment is they want the producers to undertake not to train on anything that they submit for as work, and also that they will not be expected to basically be doing polishes on material that has been initially generated by an AI, and there has been no give from the producers. It's clear that that's exactly what they would like to do. And I would imagine that right now, somewhere in Los Angeles, there's a server room full of and somebody kind of feeding screenplays into the into the mouth of this thing. I mean, the issue is volume. I mean, this is. I was listening to a podcast where somebody who's done a lot of AI writing was saying, "Oh yeah, I wrote my book in a few days," and I was like, "Well, okay, I wrote my book in 3 years, and there are many other books I could read that had that level of intense kind of care put into them. So I would probably choose not to read the thing that had been produced very quickly." So there's a kind of quality issue I mean, maybe that, maybe my 3 years is garbage, and somebody else and the AI can do that in 2 days, but maybe not. But there's you're kind of asking about a sort of two-tier system emerging, and I imagine there will be some sort of commercial role for quick and dirty narrative content of some kind of produced by content farms, and that people will consume that. I mean, there's already kind of weird bits of YouTube which seem to be like sort of largely automated kind of children's animations and so on, really kind of very uncanny valley material. So yeah, I guess that's going to happen, and then how we feel about it, what we choose to consume and what we choose to value will emerge, I suppose. But I don't think there's any doubt that will that will be tried, and if people want it, then it will carry on being made.
I think I've heard that too before, that this idea that it's going to take over a lot of the we'll have a lot of AI generated self-help and really formulaic fiction and cookbooks and this stuff, right? And that there's going to be still a market for some more literary type work, but the market for that type of work has always been very small, right? And publishers typically subsidize that by having bestsellers, the stuff that is going to be very easy to automate. And so I'm just curious about what is this going to do to the whole ecosystem? If publishers aren't getting that revenue from a lot, the sort of mass, very popular types of fiction that will be easy to I think the market's going to be flooded with that type of stuff through self-publishing, people using AI tools to generate this very quickly. Our publishing house is still going to be able to have enough revenue to support the type of work that doesn't have as much of a broad appeal. It's not as profitable, but is still deemed to have some sort of literary or civic significance, right?
Besides creating this generic literature and things like that, what do you envision for the future of education when students are able to submit all of their work this way and are not producing any of their own thoughts anymore?
Yeah, there's going to be a lot more Fivers, aren't there? A lot more kind of actual kind of face-to-face testing of people's knowledge. I mean, you can't just submit a paper. I mean, I've heard anecdotally, I think it was Cardiff University in Wales in the UK, the kind of they can see what sites people are visiting on their academic network, and there was this massive rocketing in visits to ChatGPT, and then in the final papers for all their undergraduates, they discovered that over half the material being submitted was generated. I mean, including things kind of with the prompts left in, and then the first sentence of the term paper is, "As a large language model, yes. I cannot." So if you're gonna plagiarize, you could have been doing a little bit better than that. But I mean, it's clearly a moment of crisis for educators, and what constitutes knowledge and what doesn't is in play right now. I mean, none of us remember phone numbers anymore. We used to know phone numbers, and we've outsourced that, and that the sky hasn't fallen in. So it's a question of what can be successfully, everted or outsourced to our tools, and what we actually need. And what we certainly seem to need is critical faculties, even if, we can grab the information quickly. If we can't analyze it, that's still stupid. So I think, we've got to reconceptualize what education and testing mean, and that's, it's got a lot of work.
Yeah. There was a lot of hope for a while about using AI tools to decipher if students are using AI writing, Turnitin, which detects plagiarism, has come out with a AI detector, but it only works half the time. So there's a lot of false positives. So then you have this other problem. So yeah, I have a lot of friends, and my husband teaches at the university, and they're trying to come up with these sort of stopgap measures, like doing, in-class essays. Bring back the blue book. We're gonna have it. To me, that doesn't seem like a long-term solution. I think it is going to be a more seismic change to the model of freshman English. What is that going to look like? I think it's going to be very different.
I'll just try to, I wrap us up on a note of not utter despair, because
What are you going to do all that kind of chat GPT positive language now?
The room was illuminated with extravagant
evanescent ideas floated around.
Yeah. I hopefully will not do that. But I mean, I guess it's a very weird kind of hope, and I'm not usually able to do this, but I do hear in what you guys are saying that just back to the art and commerce thing, I don't think any of us feels that the machinery of commerce is going to slow down anytime soon on this stuff. And these companies keep telling us we don't want to be in an arms race, and then they keep accelerating the arms race. So I'm not going to say that will stop. But for this particular conversation, I think, Megan, as you point out, this art has always been a kind of barnacle on the side of capitalism, and that's just how it's always been designed. And capitalism keeps changing, but it's always been, there's a patronage model, we try to write things on the back of classified ads, and then that gets blown up, and we try to write it on the back of a targeted advertising, and then now that gets blown up. And so I don't actually know that the fact that the model is changing means that the tiny subset of literary books that take 3 years to write will go away. I don't know that it won't, but I do think that it's never been where the publishers make most of their money anyway, which in our case is good news. If somebody can make the auto-generated thing and a publisher can figure out how to own that and use that to subsidize the other stuff, because there were stories about how you can get all the fanfic you want anywhere on the internet. There's no more publishing industry, and that didn't happen. So I just want us to leave here going, the barnacle might survive. I think that's all. Thank you, guys.